Hello, good morning. My name is Jiu Choi and I am a final year student at Imperial College London. So today I'm just going to briefly talk about the UCAT and give you some insight about what UCAT is and also what are some steps that you can do to start preparing for the UCAT. So what is tested in the UCAT? The UCAT now currently tests 4 sections, 3 cognitive subset sections, and 1 SJT. Now, as we can see here, there's verbal reasoning, decision making, and quantitative reasoning, as well as SJT, the situational judgment test. So the verbal reasoning section tests 44 questions at 30 seconds each, decision making 35 questions at around a minute each for each question, and quantitative reasoning 36 questions at around 43 seconds for each question, and SJT 69 and around 22 seconds per question. So how is the UCAT scored? The UCAT is scored at a total of 900 to 2,700 points, and for each cognitive subsection, it's scored from 300 to 900. And for the situational judgment, it's scored on from bands 1 to 4, with band 1 being the best and band 4 being the worst. So some students just want to know what score do they need to be competitive for medical school applications, especially as an overseas candidate. And with the UK leaving the EU, the pool for overseas candidates has grown a lot more. So now it includes people from the EU as well as people from the rest of the world aside from the UK. So I've just compiled some data points to give you a rough idea of what scores you need to be competitive for medical school applications. So from the 2025 data, we can see here that to get a score of around a 9th decile, or the top 10%, you need to score 2,220. And we can see on the bottom rows that these are the scores you need for each section of each cognitive subsection. So 700 for verbal reasoning, 740 for DM, and 820 for quantitative reasoning. So now it raises the question, what score do I need to achieve? When I look through the minimum scores required for each university as an overseas student, there were some big points that had to be addressed, but let's just go through some examples of some universities first. So for Cambridge, the average score for people admitted to Cambridge was 2,382, and that's the top 3%. And for Imperial, you needed a minimum score of 2,310, or the top 5%, in order to gain an interview. And for UCL, you need to score 2,300, or the top 6%, to get an interview. So the first 3 unis I mentioned are the Golden Triangle universities, so London universities as well as Oxbridge. But for other universities that are not Golden Triangle but still around Russell Group levels, you have the University of Manchester, which required a score of 2,250, or the top 8%. And for University of Glasgow, you need a score of 2,220, or the top 10%. So what does this mean? To have a competitive score to go to at least a medical school, you must achieve a minimum score of the 9th decile. This correlates to a score of 2,220. Now, every year, the UCAT scores tend to go higher and higher for each decile, and that's because people are better prepared for the test, or the UCAT itself is just becoming easier. We don't know what the reason is, but the scores are getting higher. So in my opinion, in order to gain a decent chance at getting to a medical school for the next application cycle, we're looking at a score of around 2,250, and for the Russell Group universities, around 2,350. Now, that sounds like a big number. Top 5%, top 10%, that is a scary number to realize. But the UCAT is an exam that you can practice for and prepare for, so don't be too afraid. So what should my strategy be for the UCAT? So what matters at the end of the day is your total score. It's not what score you have in each section, but your total score. And that's the approach I took for the UCAT. And so in level of difficulty of what Korean students tend to find the easiest and hardest portions of the test, we have quantitative reasoning, which is the easiest portion, followed by decision making and verbal reasoning. So quantitative reasoning is very simple, and it's very easy to get a high score as long as you practice well. Decision making, you need to give a little more effort as well as practice, but also it is a section that you can improve upon. Now for verbal reasoning, this tends to be the hardest section for Korean students overall, but this is a section that you can improve your score on if you practice well or if you receive a little bit of guidance. And if you want a little bit of guidance, then of course I am more than available to educate you on what strategies to use for all the 3 sections as well as for SJT. So my main advice for the UCAT is ensure you get high scores in quantitative reasoning and decision making to compensate for a weaker score in verbal reasoning. Now, what I mean is don't ignore verbal reasoning, but strategically, we want to maximize our scores in both DM and QR in order to offset any losses in verbal reasoning. So, breaking down the verbal reasoning section, the main essence of verbal reasoning is, can you quickly find the exact answers in long passages without making assumptions? And now there are 10 to 11 passages with around 4 to 5 questions per passage, and it gives you around 2 minutes for each passage and their questions in total. So there are two main approaches that we can use to solve verbal reasoning. One is to have 1 minute to read the entire passage, and then have around 10 to 15 seconds per question, or two is to skim the passage for each question. Now, my general advice is to find the right approach that works for you. My approach was that I took 1 minute to read the passage, and then I spent around 10 to 15 seconds per each question. And my reasoning for that is because there are some questions that require you to get the main essence of this passage, and that will be a bit difficult if you just skim the passage. But at the end of the day, it's most important to find the approach that works for you, rather than forcing yourself to read the passage if you can't read the entire passage in 1 minute. So the verbal reasoning questions are actually the most straightforward, but there's just not enough time. These are all questions that you can solve perfectly well or get a perfect score in if you just had enough time. And that's the main essence of the UCAT. All of these questions are very simple, it's just that there's not enough time. And so when approaching the verbal reasoning section, it might help to understand how the paragraphs of each section relate to each other. So these are the types of verbal reasoning questions. We have 6 main types, and these types, some types work better for skimming, while some types work better for reading the passage. So some of the question types that work better for reading the passage are main idea or author's opinions, inference questions, and sometimes accept questions. While for true, false, can't tell, vocabulary and context, and specific detail questions, we can tend to skim the passage. But approaching the verbal reasoning section requires a mix of both approaches. And if you need more guidance, then as always, practice more or reach out to someone you can get guidance from. I mentioned a while ago that sometimes it's better to break down the passages and see how they relate to each other to get an overall sense of how the passage flows. And this is just an example of how I broke down the passage overall. So paragraph 1 introduces a problem and potential solution. Paragraph 2 proposes what games do to help. And paragraph 3 explains why games are effective, while paragraph 4 is the impact and conclusion. So the reason why having a brief idea of how the paragraphs relate to each other is good is because when you're approaching questions, when you know how the paragraphs work with each other, you can find specific details in each paragraph relating to the question. And these are just some examples of the questions that we can see in the verbal reasoning section. So now the decision-making section. So the main essence of the decision-making section is, can you think like a careful, evidence-based problem solver under time pressure? And so we have 7 main types of DM questions. And the ones I've highlighted are the questions that Korean students tend to struggle with the most. So when approaching your practice for the decision-making section, the 2 main advice I tend to give is to 1, delineate your logic and reasoning very clearly. And 2, test each answer option to better understand the correct answer. Now, the reason you want to do this is so that you get into the process of knowing what logic or what reasoning framework the UCAT wants you to be in. And if you don't practice that well enough, you're not going to be able to solve questions properly and quickly, or you might be confused between each answer type. And this is an example of a syllogism, this is an example of an evaluating arguments question, and this is an example of logical conclusions or assumptions question. So for the quantitative reasoning section, it asks you, can you process numerical data quickly without making careless mistakes? Now, the main important bits about the quantitative reasoning section is that it's all very simple mathematics. It's just addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, nothing else. So when approaching the quantitative reasoning section, the reason why students tend to make mistakes is because they, 1, don't read the text carefully, and 2, they don't understand the figures given completely. Now, the figures given to you can be any type of infographic, it can be any type of bar chart, line chart, or even pie chart, anything that runs the gamut. And while you're solving quantitative reasoning, it's important to know that sometimes the questions build upon each other, so ensure you have clean solutions or a clean solution framework while solving each quantitative reasoning section. And this is an example of a quantitative reasoning section that you can see. And one important bit here is to first, I advise you to spend some time reading the text and understanding the graph before you approach the question, because the answers do build upon each other and the answers can be found only when you understand the graph properly. So for the SJT section is unfortunately a section that you just have to memorize and learn for. And that's because the SJT section is a very subjective question type. So the way the UCAT makes the answer for each SJT question is that they ask a group of consultants to come together and they ask them to basically mark the answer that they think is the most appropriate. But obviously different consultants can have different opinions. So at the end of the day, they choose the answer that aligns the most with the majority. So when we are approaching the SJT section, my advice is to 1, first, read and understand the core principles from the General Medical Council's Good Medical Practice. A lot of the questions relate back to the core principles found in this book, and if you understand the core principles here, then it makes answering the questions a lot easier. And 2, while you're answering the official questions for SJT on the official UCAT website, understand the reasoning with the explanations given, and make sure you understand the answer patterns for each SJT question. And 3, practice with reflection. And what I mean by that is whenever you're answering a question, relate it back to the good medical practice and relate it back to whether you think is the right answer and what you think your reasoning process is. And all these 3 steps link to each other in a continuous cycle. So just do that process over again and again and again until you understand what the SJT is looking for. So, quick resources. There are lots of paper-based and online question banks out there, and some examples are Get Into Medical School 1,300 UCAT practice questions, which I found really useful, as well as the Medify online question bank. But the best resource out there is the official UCAT website. They have around 4 question banks for each subset, and also 5 official practice tests. My advice is to use the official UCAT resources towards the end or when you're closer to your exam date, as they provide the most realistic questions that you can expect for your exam. And lastly, my overall advice is just practice, practice, and practice. The UCAT is an exam that you can prepare for. The more you practice, the better your score is. And while you're practicing, it's important to reflect, reflect, and reflect. Think about your reasoning, think about why your answers are wrong or why your answers are correct, and always relate back to the main principles and to your solution process. And with that, I wish you the best of luck for your UCAT practice, and if you have any questions, just refer to 사람사랑유학원 for any guidance that you want. Thank you.